Good afternoon, Chair.
Good afternoon.
We're going to hear from Sami Sabbat now.
Yeah.
He's just being brought into the room.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sabbat. As you know, I'm Julian Blake, and I'm going to be asking questions on behalf of the Chair this afternoon.
Okay.
You have in front of you a witness statement, and it should be dated the 19th of January of this year. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Could I ask you just to look at the final page? That's page, I think, 12. And can you confirm that that's your signature there?
Yes, it is.
And can you confirm that the statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. That statement's going to be going into evidence, and I'm going to ask you additional questions now. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? Where were you born?
I was born in Egypt.
And how long ago was that?
Oh, a hell of a long time ago. 1955, so 66 years ago.
And I think you are married and you have a daughter who's about 30 years old now.
Yes, she's 30. She turned 31 at the end of January, yes.
You've lived around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. I actually wrote a book called Judge Me If You Can, and it's got all the information within it, so I can just remember it now.
If you can condense that book into about a paragraph.
I will, don't worry. Yes, born in Cairo in 1955. 3 years later, traveled to Saudi Arabia with my parents, where we lived for about 4 years. Back to Cairo in 1962. 1966, traveled to the United States, where we lived in Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky, 3 years. We then moved to Libya, where we were there when the revolution started and Gaddafi took over. Didn't like it very much. Then we came to the UK in 1970. The whole family came to the UK in 1970.
And I think you studied in the UK?
I studied in the UK. Most of my studies from secondary school onwards in the UK. I graduated with an honours degree in electronics engineering at Sheffield University. And I then, having worked for a while, I then did a master's degree, an MBA at Middlesex University.
And can you tell us what jobs you did before taking over a post office?
Well, I started off, I worked for Philips Electronics as a trainee engineer. I then worked for Philips as an industrial, work-study engineer it was called. I worked for Gillette as an industrial engineer, and then post-MBA I moved to finance. I was the financial analyst, Gillette Northern European division, and then financial reporting analyst for the European division. I then got a job, which appeared to have been just written for me, as an operation and business development manager for an American multinational, packaging multinational. My job was to identify opportunities and help and get certain joint ventures or find partners in the Middle East, Africa, and Indian subcontinent. So look at the marketplace, identify markets that would be good for us, and also support the existing joint ventures to do well and to make sure that they succeed. I then worked as a commercial manager. I went to Saudi Arabia, worked there as a commercial manager for a can manufacturing company, which was one of the joint ventures for the company I had worked for. I then was asked to go to Egypt to help set up a can-making company, the first two-piece, what is called two-piece can-making company in North Africa, which I did, successfully completed that. And I worked in Egypt as well as was asked to go for a private hospital, a 250-bed private hospital, where I was the operations director, or director of operations, not the medical operations, but the overall operations, until I decided to come back to the UK in 2003.
So, having led a varied career, what made you want to take over a post office?
Basically, when I left Egypt, I'd had pretty high-level jobs, very stressful jobs, which I didn't mind as such, but I thought that I'd had enough of the rat race, and I thought I'd opt out of the rat race and get a small business. I didn't really need much money at the time. I had enough. I thought I had enough. And was looking for something that was like that, and thought, well, why not newsagents and the post office? And the reason I thought of the post office was because I thought that the post office would provide a regular income, which would then support the business. So basically opting out of the rat race.
And your first post office was the West Beach post office?
Yes, it was.
And where was that?
That was in Shoreham by Sea. And it was actually, the reason it was called West Beach is because Shoreham has got like a peninsula, almost an island, which is Shoreham Beach. And that was divided into two parts, east and west. Obviously, west side was West Beach.
And when was that approximately?
2003, I think I might have taken it over. I set up a company called Shore Life Limited, which then in turn bought this West Beach Post Office in about May 2003.
And then there was another post office that you took over?
Yes, I, having worked with the post office and the business, I slowly decided or felt that it wasn't that challenging, although I had started to do some relief work to get to know how other post offices were run and other retail outlets were run. I decided that I needed a little bit more than that. Silly me. There was another office at East Beach, which was only about a mile or so away from West Beach, and I had spoken with the landlady there, who was mature, and she was practically almost in her 70s, and I managed to persuade her that perhaps she might be better off retiring, which she did, and I took over the post office from her.
And having taken over two post offices, I think there was a third.
Then I can monopolize the beach. Then, at the same time, because it had taken quite a while for the process to go through, to be completed with the purchase of that, another opportunity arose, which is Mill Lane, which is in Port Slade, which is only about 3-4 miles away from Shoreham Beach, became available and showed a really good return on investment. And I couldn't resist that one as well, so I took that one as well.
And initially, were those successful?
Yes, they were successful. I also, apart from that, I also did some business services and some general consultancy work and stuff like that. But the businesses themselves were successful.
Do you remember approximately how much they cost at all?
All three branches, they didn't cost an enormous amount. I think it was Mill Lane, West Beach was about 45,000. East Beach was less than that, I believe around 40,000, and Mill Lane around 75,000.
I'd like to talk to you about discrepancies. When did you first experience discrepancies? Do you remember?
Well, I first experienced discrepancies with West Beach, albeit they're very small, because West Beach was the smaller of all three post offices, sub-post offices. But I thought it was my fault, inexperience and all that. It wasn't as, the amounts were fairly small because of the size of its one small post office. So that's when I started experiencing them. Then when I took over the other two post offices, All of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, about 6 months, or almost a year, 8 months, whatever, I was then sent what they call error messages. And there were quite a lot of errors there. You know, we were talking about hundreds of pounds. And I was absolutely shocked because apparently they're supposed to have occurred months earlier.
And I think it was around 2006 that you first started to do something about that. Is that right?
2006 is actually when it started to happen, yes, and started to get that. Then the problem is it was always the postmaster who is responsible for proving that it's not, that the errors were incorrect. And that was almost impossible to prove. And I was caught out because having to look through a year's work, a year's errors or data was very, very tricky, very bad. You get slips from your Horizon system, and that's all you've got to go on. So you've got to look at all the slips, compare them, and then try to compare something else. And you can't really interrogate the computer itself, the system itself.
Did you call the helpline?
I called the helpline, and they weren't really that helpful. You know, they don't like people calling them. In fact, at one point, I had written to somebody had actually said to me, because I'd written a lot of correspondences to different people, post offices, they don't like telephone calls. The helpline doesn't really like telephone calls, and they'd rather that you, if you get error messages and whatnot, you send a written correspondence. But yes, I did talk to a few of them, but it was, you're wrong, we're right.
And you've mentioned correspondence, and you've exhibited to your statements some correspondence. I'm not going to go into detail about each and every letter, but perhaps you can give one or two examples of exchanges that you had.
Well, I've exchanged several correspondences, hundreds maybe, of correspondences, so much so that I was actually asked to stop writing. It had taken me, well, the 2 years between 2006 and 2008, I was trying to make them see that there is an issue, that there is a problem. I'd written to different managers, every time I get an error notice, things that were, for example, there was a check all of a sudden, once I realized that these errors were going on, and I had to be very, very careful, and I had to be quite alert to what's happening and look at the system properly. There was a check, for example, that was but it wasn't on the system, £300 worth. When I called them, they eventually found, oh yes, it's there, so we'll credit it to you on the system, because the system was showing, as far as I was concerned, a negative £300. And when they did this, I had a £600 error, shortfall, instead of the 300 being wiped out. And there were several things like this, a lot of things with the lottery, a lot of things that which I'd written about, that things that kept disappearing and then reappearing. We had currency that was sent to head office that was completely settled, and all of a sudden it appeared again on the system.
And you said that you sent correspondence between 2006 and 2008.
Yes, well, even beyond that, but yes.
But once 2008 hit, 17th of March of that year, you received an audit, is that right?
Yes.
And how many auditors attended the property?
Well, I wasn't there at the time. I had a phone call from Mill Lane at first, who said, help, we've got auditors here. And I can't remember how many there were. And then I had another phone call from East Beach saying, we've got auditors here. So they attacked both post offices, or attended post offices at the same time. I went over. There was nothing I could do or talk to them about this. I had, well, Do you want me to be specific as to what you said? Just answer the question, or?
Well, that's fine. I mean, they attended both two of the post offices.
Yes.
How about your home?
Well, this is it. I was. What had happened was afterwards, two of them came to my home, and decided that they needed to search or look for anything that might show that I may have taken all this money, because apparently it was about in both post offices around £50,000. They came to my home in the evening afterwards, and we sat. They looked around, and we sat in my office, and they looked through everything, opened my drawers, cupboards, everything. They had 2 big boxes with them and calculators and everything. It was quite frightening, but I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. What had happened was having been through all this hassle with the correspondences and meetings, particularly with the contract manager, who was she wasn't very helpful, and in fact, I think she got really angry with me and upset with me, and I keep thinking until today she was being vindictive by making sure that I paid for it somehow.
Do you remember any conversations that you had in your house with the auditors at all?
Yes, well, they interrogated me. They taped what I was doing. They talked as I was sitting there watching them take everything out and have a look at it. Every so often, they would find some document or something, and they'd look at each other, saying, "Oh, he's in trouble," and they put it into the box. They wouldn't say why or whatever. They just did that. They took a lot of documents, filled the box up almost, and then I was interrogated and taped.
And where did that take place?
In the office, my home.
Were you aware at that time that there were other people in the same position?
No.
And you were suspended after that audit?
I was immediately suspended, yes. I was told by the auditors when they left that I would be contacted, but it may take 2 weeks before I am contacted, for them to have another meeting with me and to discuss this. At the time, I had already, as I said to you earlier, part of the business was to do some sort of consultancy, and I was doing some training, and I had a management training course that I was going to deliver in Egypt for the Egyptian Post Office. It had nothing to do with the Post Office in the UK. It's just part of a training program. And that, unfortunately, was due to be done in April, beginning of April. So I had to contend with this. I had to go and deliver this training, which took all my might to try and put it behind me and just concentrate on the training. And I got back 2 weeks later. Nothing happened. They never contacted me. What I had decided to do before this, because of all the issues that I'd had with the post office, was I became fed up and saw that there was just no way of me. This is just taking too much of my time, and I was becoming almost bankrupt. Over the 2 years or so that this has been happening, I've been subsidizing the post office from the other shops and other businesses, from my own finances. And I thought this just cannot be. Perhaps it would be better if I sold the post offices off. And that's what I decided to do. Unfortunately, the government had decided that they're going to shut, and this was before the audit.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'll keep going.
No, that's carry on, please.
The government decided to shut the post offices, and they've chosen one of my post office, West Beach, as one of the ones to be closed. In the meantime, trying to sell the business was almost impossible, because nobody's going to buy a post office business knowing that it might close down. So it was very, very difficult. The other thing is I had to resign so that the post office would advertise the business on their website as part of the businesses that are available for sale. I don't know whether that had anything to do with it or what, but they never spoke to me about the audit. We never had a face-to-face discussion. We never tried to sort it out, despite of the several tens of correspondences that I've written, including a couple to Alan Clark himself, including to whoever I could, to try and get a face-to-face meeting, pleading with them not to destroy me and my family. Not to destroy me, but to try and just talk about it. I had initially, there came a time towards the end where I know that I was expecting compensation for the post office that closed West Beach, and they hadn't given it to me. £40,000. They still had it in their hands, and they hadn't given it to me.
There was a time when you were prosecuted.
Sorry?
There was a time when you were prosecuted by the post office. You were prosecuted?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was. Yes, I was just going to say, sorry, yes,
no,
I was.
On.
Yes, I was.
Yes, and in terms of timing, when was that?
That was in 2008. It started off. The start of it was 2008.
And do you remember what you were charged with?
I was charged with the. What had happened was, because I was going to say, because of all this lack of cash flow, I had two choices: either to shut the post offices down and get rid of all the staff, and I had about 15 at the time, maybe 13. West Beach had shut down. If I did this, the staff would lose their livelihood, the community would lose its post offices, and I just didn't see what would happen. I knew that the £40,000 was coming to me. The post office did not want to help in any way, shape, or size. They would not give me anything. I did plead with them to say that they're bankrupting me and so on, but to no benefit. Anyway, what happened then was I had decided that one way of trying to get around this is to write post-dated checks and have the staff also write down what had happened and what's been happening and document everything so that everything is transparent. No one could ever say that I was trying to steal any money. I just was between a rock and a hard place. I had to do something. And that something is going to affect everybody, and it could affect them detrimentally, as well as myself, of course, because I was the business. So I'd written these checks. So the actual charges were to do with that I had said that I had checks to the value of whatever it was at each post office, in total about £50,000, when I had not, leaving the post office at the risk of loss or using the money for my gain. So using money for my gain or post office at the risk of loss.
And do you remember what the official charge was?
That's all I know of the charge. This was officially it.
Was it fraud by false representation or?
False representation, I guess. Yes, I guess that's what it was.
It came to court. You went to the magistrates' court.
Started off going to the magistrates' court, yes.
And then you went to the Crown Court.
Not quite. It went to the magistrates' court. I had already, by that time, post office had already sent me a document stating how much I owed them, and whereas they discovered £50,000 shortages, the actual figure, according to them, on a document that they had sent to me, was 62,000 and something pounds. Actually, when I tried to work it out, the figures just didn't add up. But at the time, you're scared. You don't know what to do. You just almost on panic button. And then they'd taken off the 40,000 and whatever, and then it ended up at about 20,000, which then later changed and became 20,000, which changed and became something else. I had paid already 10,000 for my own money, so reducing it supposedly to around 10,000 and something. So that was when they first when I actually appeared in court, I'd only really owed them about 10, 12,000, 19, 20,000, if that. And I had said that I would pay the rest when I sold the business, because I was trying to sell the business. They did not complete the paperwork in time, and so the magistrate could not transfer me to the Crown Court, so he dismissed the case. My solicitor at the time said, "Sammy, you're free. They're unlikely to come back for you because they will have a bloody nose and they're not going to come back for you. Besides, there's also been about £10,000 left, or as it turned out, 13,000, and that kept fluctuating." 4 months later, they decided to serve me with exactly the same, for the summons, exactly the same charges. And then it went to the Magistrates' Court, and then it went to the Crown Court.
And you appeared at Lewes Crown Court on the 26th of June 2009.
Yes, I did.
And I think that's where you pleaded guilty, is that right?
Yes, I was told I had to plead guilty to have a better chance of not actually going to prison. If I don't do that, then the likelihood is that I'll definitely go to prison, which can be anything up to 6, 7 years, whatever it is.
And how did you feel about that?
I felt terrible. I had a choice to make. Do what I think, which I'm saying I'm not guilty, or plead guilty and hope for the best, because that would be the better chance of not going to court. But I didn't stop there. I wrote to different people. I wrote to Alan Clark, who is the head of managing director of Post Office Limited at the time. And I had said to him, and I had written to him before about the errors and how unfair they were, and how that you are really claiming paper money, not actual money. You have not actually lost cash. This is all paper stuff. And yet you're claiming it and you're taking it off us. So actually you're making money out of it, basically, as I said that to him. But I said, look, this is what's happening. I had to plead guilty. However, can we talk and discuss this and try to settle this without having to go to litigation, without destroying all this? And I had the reply from him of saying, well, you did this, you did that, your offense is serious enough that they decide to prosecute you, and I'm afraid the case must go on. And yes, you did say that you're going to pay when you sold your post office, but you have to instruct your solicitors formally to give us the money back when you sold it. But nevertheless, even if I did that, they'd still continue with the case. I then wrote to the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Brown, and had a reply from his office who said that he'd asked them to look into it. Again, saying the same thing. I had to plead guilty because otherwise the sentence, the punishment would be severe, and I didn't want that.
And you came to be sentenced on the 7th of August of 2009?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
That was terrible. That was probably one of the worst days of my life. Picture this. You have been a prominent member of any community. You worked hard. You achieved a lot of good qualifications. You've achieved status. You've mixed with royalty, with senior personnel, with prime ministers, with all different types of society. Not that you're arrogant about it, because, okay, everybody's equal. But nevertheless, you went through this. And now all of a sudden, because I went to a probation office, I went to other places, and I saw people there that were probably ardent criminals. And I think to myself, and you think, am I like this? I'm now, this is what I am. Forget about all this other life, this is what I am. And then you go into the courtroom. Before, in the courtroom, my wife was with me, as well as my mother-in-law and my brother and sister-in-law. And you go into the dock. You can imagine going into the dock. You must know it's like. And it was the first time that I realized where perhaps the comment going down came from. You stand in the dock and there's stairs going down into the cell where you would be sent when you're eventually judged to be guilty and you're sent down. And that's where I was feeling that I might go. I remember giving my wallet, giving my mobile to my wife, saying, this is it in case I don't come back with you.
And what sentence did you receive?
Well, in the end, I received a 1 year's custodial sentence, twice for the two branches, the two cases, plus 180 hours community service.
During the sentencing hearing, did you think that you might go to prison?
We had to send references to the judge, character references, 3 character references. One of the character references was from a friend of mine, a doctor, PhD, worked for a large defense company, very well respected. And in his reference, he had written that he felt that the post office was, sorry.
It's okay, take your time.
The post office was unfair. And the judge held this reference and he waved it and said, how dare he say that the post office is unfair? I cannot accept this. Now, what do you think as a defendant you would feel or think when that happens? You're going to go down. He's not even prepared to accept. He's already made up his mind. Forget about the fact that he said you're guilty, but he's already made up his mind. And my knees almost gave way. A lady walked in, holding a piece of paper in her hand, and she gave it to the judge, who then unfolded it, and then stopped my barrister from talking and said, okay, I'm going to put you out of your misery. The barrister was saying things about recession and whatnot. He opened it and said he put us out of his misery. And he then turned to me, and that was the first time that anybody ever talked to me throughout my court hearings. No one ever cared what I thought or felt or anything like that. And he said, until now, you have been a man of good character. But now you have destroyed this in spectacular fashion. So I'm no longer this man of good character. And he pronounced the sentence, which was, as I said earlier, a year for everyone. And that was an enormous relief, because at that point I thought, oh, at least, thank God, I'm not going to actually go down. I'm not going to actually go to prison. But it was the only time where I actually felt better. Before that, I really was going to collapse. And I just could not believe how this could happen.
And you were sentenced to 180 hours of community service in addition to the suspended sentence.
Yes.
Can you tell us what you did for that 180 hours?
I consider myself lucky, because I worked for for a furniture charity shop. So that's what I had to do. I had to obviously clean and everything. But this wasn't alien to me. This cleaning, whatever, I could have done a lot worse than that, because in order to save the business before this summons, before the audit, to try and make the business survive, I had this, and not have to force any member of my staff to lose their livelihood. I actually took a job at a petrol station in the evenings. So I was during the day trying to get the business, keep it together somehow. And in the evening, I worked at the local petrol station, filling shelves, taking money from customers, cleaning toilets and the floors. So I did all that.
In addition to the sentence, I think...
And then the sentence came, and so that was, I think maybe somebody was trying to prepare me for that.
I think you also had to pay the prosecution's costs, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to move on to the impact on you, the financial impact and personal impact. Let's start with financial. When you had the discrepancies, how did you manage to pay for that?
Borrowed money. Went to our families, my wife and I. We borrowed what we could have, what we could borrow. And it was a lot. We actually had, in Egypt, we had built a house, and it was there. We couldn't sell it. And so they knew that they probably would get their money back, I guess. But they were prepared to help us, and that's how they did it. And so using that money, I'd already my credit cards were all to the limits. I had loans. I couldn't find the cash to pay for the discrepancies unless I borrowed it, and that's what I had to do. At the time, I remember I didn't have £2, more than £2 in my pocket, just to give me enough petrol to take me to purchase stuff for the shop or whatever. But
I think you said at one stage it reached about £62,000. Do you recall how much you repaid in total to the post office?
I paid in total, well, I think in total it was 67,000, because after all the 40,000 and odd, £40,300, plus the withheld salaries and so on and so forth, it all comes out to about almost 68,000.
And I think we've heard from other witnesses some other kinds of financial impact, such as on insurance and your ability to get insurance.
Oh, right? We lost the home insurance. They wouldn't insure us.
And is that because you had a
because you had a criminal record? Once you've got it, and I learned a lot about this. Getting a criminal record isn't going to make it easier for you. It's going to make it even worse, because then there are consequences of having that criminal black mark against you, and everything becomes expensive if you can get it. Any insurance and anything would be very expensive. In terms of the home insurance, you can't. And then you try to apply to other companies. Have you ever been refused insurances? Yes, I have. Well, sorry.
Moving on to personal impact, how did it affect your reputation?
Well, as the judge says, in spectacular manner. People just thought you were a thief. Community police officer, after this, before the sentence, before even that, they heard about the fact that I had been summoned by the post office, etc., and put 2 and 2 together and made 15, and said decided I was a thief and dishonest. And one day there were some diaries that we were going to throw out, shop diaries, newsagents type diaries, where no newspapers for number 15, no newspaper for number 25, and whatever. And she decided to take that. Maybe somebody had complained to her, and told me that she's going to have to take it to the police station because she's going to have to report me because of the data protection, and you've thrown these out at the back door. They were out at the back door, etc. In the end, of course, they came back and they just said, well, you just don't do it again. But it's that sort of thing. Afterwards, the neighbors just would not really talk to you. They tried to avoid you. People tried to avoid us everywhere.
How did it?
One of the worst things, of course, is the newspaper that actually wrote an article about it. The post office manager pockets money, and that was there until, well, even there now. Anybody who goes into the internet and Googles my name, that's the first thing that comes up. There's this criminal who's pocketed all this money. The way they worded it, they made a lot of things that was said that weren't quite true, but nevertheless, it's there for everybody. That didn't help the reputation very much. People would walk across the street sometimes, so as not to talk to you. And even if they don't say anything, you still feel, it's the feeling about me, it's not just the other people, it's how I myself felt. We eventually had to leave our house. We tried to sell it and had somebody renting it before they bought it, and we moved out somewhere else. And we lost quite a lot of money having to go backwards and forwards. But the only way we could do it is to get away from all this. We had creditors call me. I hated my ringtone because it meant that there was a creditor on the other end and threatening to come to my house and take things and stuff like that. So I had to put up with that. Reputation completely destroyed.
And how about your wife and your daughter?
My wife felt terrible. Actually, a friend of mine's partner told my wife, advised her strongly to leave me. Said I was a criminal and that she should leave me. Fortunately, my wife was excellent. And she stood by me.
I appreciate it. It's difficult.
It is difficult, yes. Sorry.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, it affected both my wife and my daughter because they, of course, were subjected to the same sort of thing. They are partners or daughter or whatever of a criminal. And of course he's a criminal, What else can he be? And you start thinking all sorts of different things, how they felt about you from the start, that sort of, a lot of things. It's not very, very good, I assure you.
How did it affect your health?
How it affected my health? Quite a lot. I developed diabetes. I then, later on, my behavior changed, my attitude, I became a bit more aggressive. My wife and I, we quarreled a lot. We still do because of the way I had become. I've become a different person. My siblings said that I'm a different person and had a lot of issues with them. And that then at work, where I managed to work, they were also very stressful, etc. I eventually developed a heart attack. Well, I had a heart attack. And as a result of that heart attack, I had to have an open heart surgery with 5 bypasses. I'm still alive, but my peripheral vision is completely gone because what had happened, my blood pressure was reduced, or it could have been the machines, as they might say, and it had affected the nerves in my eyes. Not enough oxygen was received by my nerves, and so if you think of the vision being a circle and there's the horizontal, the horizon, I cannot see anything below that. I can see above, I can see you, but I cannot see anything below. So if I'm walking, and my legs would testify to this, something there, I won't see it and I'll walk straight into it. So that had affected, that's how much affected my head. I have tinnitus. I've got this ringing noise all the time in my ears. I have a problem with my nose, is that it is always runny, and I have to take nasal spray to stop it from doing that. My health was affected quite significantly, both mentally and physically.
In terms of compensation, as somebody who had been convicted, presumably you received an interim payment.
Yes.
And I think you were also part of the group litigation, is that right?
No, when you say group litigation, is that the 555?
Yeah.
No, I'm not. At the time when that happened, and I heard about it, I've just been healing from the heart attack and whatnot, and in any case, I wasn't part of that group at all.
Okay. What would you like from the post office?
I guess, like a lot of people, what happens with this is that first of all, you're terrified, you're scared. You can't think. You're in panic mode. You're trying to avoid something. You're trying to avoid punishment. You're trying to avoid, in this case, going to prison. Then you've got this conviction and you've lost your reputation, etc. But I always try to pick myself up and just carry on. And I suppressed everything. And these emotions, I never used to have these emotions in the past. I just carried on. And then the euphoria when we eventually found out that, my sentence is going to be quashed, that my name is exonerated, I'm exonerated. My wife and I jumped up and down with joy. And then that happiness starts fading and you start becoming angry, so angry with the people who did this. Because if it had been found out now that this was wrong, that it shouldn't have happened, and they admitted it because they settled out of court and said that they were wrong, from what I understand. They not only made me go through all this, but when the first case, the magistrate's case, was dropped, they came back after me without any thought, despite any pleas, despite anything, for pittance of money. How angry do you think I should be with that? They, at the time, 2007, roughly 2008, 14,000 plus branches of the post office were making £4 million loss. A £4 million loss a week. And yet, the managing director gets a bonus. He gets a bonus. He gets a bonus, another bonus that he'll get for 5 years, on top of his £300,000 and £250,000 salary, whatever, and the Royal Mail as well got other bonuses. And for £20,000, I was completely destroyed. Not even £20,000, because by that time there was only about what they said, and that's all their figures. I could not query those. I could never contest them. Their figures, £13,000. They destroyed a man and his family for £13,000. They had a chance not to do that when the first case collapsed. But 4 months later, they insisted that they're going to come back and they would completely annihilate me. Despite what I wrote to them, they would not stop. How would I feel? What sort of compensation? What they have caused me, the pain and anguish. I wish I could have, if I had a normal existence, if this didn't happen, the business was starting to go towards the £1 million turnover. I can imagine I could have grown it a lot more. And it could have become possibly much bigger. Who knows, there may have been chains of that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, forget about the business. Supposing I decided to work. Well, with all my qualifications and experience at the time, not that they helped me with this post office, I could have earned at least 90, 100,000 pounds, 85, 90, whatever, thousand pounds in those days. And that could have happened, that could have lasted for what, until today, 14, 15,000. I had to retire early because of ill health. So I had to scrip and save. I couldn't afford things. I had to sell my car, I had to sell my house. I had to try and avoid creditors. I had to come to agreements to pay very little, but whatever I could, basically, which is very little. But that's how I lived for the last 14 years or so, having to do that. I want not to feel like that. I want to feel worth it. I lost my confidence. I'd lost, and this loss of confidence made me more aggressive and perhaps made me confrontational with other people to try and prove that I am good. I'm not that so-called nobody thief or whatever that you have made me out to be. And that has its price, not only just the financial, but all the health, all the mental things that I've been going through. I want that. Obviously, I want a really good compensation to compensate for that. I don't know what you can think and imagine. Even the potential of a good pension is gone. You know, imagine how much pension I could have earned if I, say, invested my money, or even in a pension scheme if I was working for a company at the levels that I would have been able to work on. What would I have done? And that would have taken me maybe 20, 30 years. What pot would I have had in the end? And that's the sort of thing that I want the post office to pay for, as well as these people. Why? Why did they do this? Is it really the contract manager, Carol Ballon, I think her name was? Was she really so vindictive that she wanted to destroy me because I thought that she lied the last time we met, and the meeting minutes of the meeting were distorted, and things in there that was said that weren't really said, and they were put out of context? And I said that to her, and I wrote her a reply to that effect. Is that what happened? Why did... And I wrote to him saying, I want somebody who's unbiased, Alan Cook. I want somebody who is unbiased, somebody who can think logically, to see what is going on, what the hell's going on, what's going on with the systems. And he just said, it gives me no pleasure. I know it gives me no pleasure to write you such a thing, but basically tough. You know, the case will have to take its course. All these people that they have destroyed, not just me, all of them. How could they not have known? This has taken over 20 years. 20 years, you can't start to think, well, what's going on here? Are all these people, I don't know how many there were, 700 or something, maybe more, are all of them thieves? And this person who's been writing to us, telling us that there's an issue, is he also an idiot? I was saying, they would tell me, oh, you've got to prove. I say to them, the money disappears from the computer. It sometimes appears and disappears. Oh, well, you've got to prove it. How do I prove it? I don't have control of the computer. I can't interrogate it. I can't do anything. How do I prove something appearing or disappearing? They need to be held accountable. The compensations need to be proportional and according to the severity of their action, and the individuals who are responsible at the time should answer to that. They're happy. They've taken their millions of bonuses and whatnot, or golden goodbyes, as I believe Alan Cook probably did when he went somewhere else and whatever. And I don't know what the contract manager did or the others. They're happy there. But what about us?
Thank you, Mr. Sabat. I don't have any further questions, but perhaps the chair may.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Blake. Thank you, Mr. Sabat, for your evidence this afternoon. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for allowing me to voice it. It's a great help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, we're now going to have a few statements read in before the break.
Yeah, fine.
Thank you. Mrs. Abbott, if you'd like to, you can just take a seat or have a biscuit.
Sir, we have 3 witness summaries to read on behalf of clients represented by Hudgell's solicitors. And with your leave, I'll start with the summary of the evidence of Mr. David Blakey.
Yeah, fine.
Thank you. Mr. Blakey and his wife took out a loan, and together they took over Ruby Square Post Office branch. Mr. Blakey's wife, Gillian, became the sub-postmistress and worked at the post office from 1996. A summary of Mrs. Blakey's evidence has already been read for the inquiry during yesterday's hearings, and they've both produced full statements. Mr. Blakey says they would often struggle with balancing the accounts. When the Horizon system was introduced in 2000, he attended a one-day training and a trainer came to their post office. He says the trainer lacked understanding of the system. When there were shortfalls, he paid them directly into the branch. On 13th May 2004, Mr. Blakey says there was an audit. At that time, he says he knew there had been a shortfall the night before, and that shortfall amounted to just under £65,000. He told auditors himself about the shortfall, and they called the fraud investigation team. In an interview, Mr. Blakey recalls he was asked if he had spent the money on another woman or on gambling debts. He says that the investigators were very aggressive, and he told them that none of what they were saying was true. He recalls seeing the transcript of the interview, and he says his denials were not recorded. He was not represented in interview. He was summoned to court, and he says he was advised the evidence against him could potentially result in his imprisonment for 18 months to 3 years on charges of theft and false accounting. He was advised, following transfer to the Crown Court, to plead guilty. Otherwise, he recalls, he was advised he could be looking at a 3 to 5 year custodial sentence. He said he would not plead guilty to theft, but would plead guilty to false accounting. During the trial, he recalls the post office was asked to produce evidence of theft, which they could not produce. He recalls the judge commenting that he knew Mr. Blakey was not a thief, but he called him a fool. He was sentenced to 9 months in prison on false accounting charges, suspended for 2 years. He recalls the judge paused when he said 9 months in prison, so Mr. Blakey thought he was not going home that day. Following his conviction, the post office asked Mr. Blakey to pay back £65,000. He and his wife were forced to declare bankruptcy. They lost their car and their mortgage. They were forced to sell their home. They tried to sell the post office and found 3 potential buyers, but say the post office blocked each sale. In September 2017, Mr. Blakey suffered a stroke. This forced him into retirement. He fully believes the stress and anxiety of the situation and having to relive it contributed to his stroke. He suffered with low mood, a poor sleep pattern, tiredness, a loss of enjoyment in his activities, a poor appetite, poor concentration, a lack of motivation, low self-esteem, feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, and low self-confidence, and also feelings of guilt. He says he experienced suicidal thoughts, although he did not act upon them. Mr. Blakey lost his job following the allegations made against him, and he stopped paying into his pension. He says his conviction also had a substantial impact on his relationships. He felt bitter, angry, and betrayed. He recalls his wife says he used to be the life and soul of the party, and he says this is taken away from him. He had a difficult relationship with his daughter for 20 years, but he says they've now reconnected and have an excellent relationship. His mum passed away before his conviction was overturned. Mr. Blakey says that even though his innocence has been proven, he feels guilty about going through everything in the first place. He wants the inquiry to know that he feels guilty about the impact everything has had on his family. But one of the biggest things for him remains that he now does not own anything. So, we move now to the summary of the evidence of Mrs. Cashmere Gill. Mrs. Gill and her husband worked hard for many years to build up a large business. She's been married for 46 years and has 3 adult children. Her family operated 2 post office branches, and she also had the role of branch manager at Cowley Road Post Office. The family owned Cowley Road Post Office and Underhill Circus Post Office, and she recalls there were issues with Horizon at both branches. She and her family decided to sell Underhill Circus as it was making losses due to frequent balancing problems with Horizon. Yet, they continued to experience shortfalls. Following an audit at Cowley Road in June 2009, a shortfall of around £50,000 was discovered, and Mrs. Gill was prosecuted for theft, fraud, and false accounting. Her contract was terminated in July 2008. Following legal advice, she pleaded guilty and was given a suspended sentence, a fine, and ordered to pay legal costs. Her conviction was overturned in April 2021. Ms. Gill says for a period of around 6 months, she lived in constant fear of going to prison. She says before Horizon, she had a very happy and successful life. She says she and her husband were in a comfortable position, and they now feel that their retirement has been taken away from them. The accusations and her conviction have had a profound impact on Mrs. Gill's mental health. She has been assessed by a psychiatrist and diagnosed with acute stress reaction, post-traumatic stress disorder, and enduring personality change after catastrophic experience. She says she avoids going to the local area to do her shopping and now travels further away to avoid people and the anxiety it causes. She cannot go to the temple to pray when other people are in there. She says her family name was tarnished. She and her husband have suffered significant financial hardship following her conviction and have had to sell their businesses and property, as well as relying on family for financial assistance. She wants the inquiry to know she still feels embarrassed, although she knows she has done nothing wrong. She believes nothing can undo what her family has been subject to, and she says the experience will stay with them for the rest of their lives. Finally, sir, we turn to a summary of the evidence of Mr. Carl Page. Carl Page became sub-postmaster of the Ridgely branch in April 1997. From around 2001, he began to notice shortfalls. He asked for further training, but says this fell on deaf ears. He made good shortfalls, which were only small amounts at first. On the 13th of January 2003, he received a call from Staffordshire Police and was asked to attend the police station. He was informed then a customer from the post office had been arrested on the grounds of money laundering, and Mr. Page was suspected of conspiring with him. An audit was conducted and identified a shortfall which was substantial. Mr. Page was arrested in January 2003 and suspended on the 14th of January 2003. Following his arrest, he says he was interviewed by post office investigators, and he describes the manner of the investigation as extremely humiliating and upsetting. He believes his contract was terminated in the autumn of 2003. In December 2003, the Post Office initiated criminal proceedings for theft of £586,000 and money laundering proceedings. His trial took place in June 2005 when he pleaded not guilty to charges of theft and money laundering. He was acquitted of money laundering, and a verdict could not be reached on the alleged theft. Subsequently, the Post Office again brought charges of theft, but again, this time concerning £282,000. He was advised, again, that if convicted, he could face 7 years in prison. He says he was advised at that time to plead guilty to theft of £94,000. He says he recalls being told anything less than £100,000 would get me only 2 years in prison. Mr. Page says he took this advice as he had a child and a family. He pleaded guilty in December 2006. He was sentenced in January 2007 to 2 years imprisonment. He was in prison for 6 months and then on a tag for the remainder of his sentence. Following on from his conviction, Mr. Page suffers with PTSD. He says of his time in custody, "Prison itself was such a humiliating experience." He says, "I felt absolutely worthless. I felt upset and angry, and I'd lost everything I'd worked hard for." His conviction was quashed in April 2021. He reports he lost a significant amount of weight in prison, dropping from 110 kilos to 91 kilos. He suffered intrusive memories, and he began taking antidepressants in March 2008. He goes on in his statement to describe the financial impact of conviction, which included bankruptcy, increased insurance costs, and an inability to secure or to change employment. He says many roles and opportunities were denied to him because he needed a clean CRB check. He describes the whole process from his initial arrest through investigation, trial and appeal, and says it's had a significant impact on his relationships. He split from his first wife in 2001, but recounts that he had a good relationship with his sons. He says this was stopped when he was arrested. He says, "My sons had to change their name to avoid the negative stigma attached to what happened to me as they continued in their respective professions." He says, and goes on to describe the impact on his own mental health. "Things were getting on top of me and my debts were building up." This ended in a suicide attempt in January 2014, and I was admitted to a mental health hospital for 3 weeks. Following this suicide attempt, he recounts, his daughter's mother stopped him seeing her for around 4 years. He was very close to his daughter, and he found this devastating, but says he understood the rationale behind it. He had married in 2003, and he split from his second wife in 2008. He says, as a result of the strain of the prosecution and his conviction, he said he had found it difficult to be close to her or to anyone. Although Mr. Page's parents stood by him, he wants the inquiry to know he always had in the back of his mind that he thought they must have thought he was guilty. His dad passed away before his conviction was quashed. He now feels his father died not knowing the truth. Mr. Page wants the inquiry to know that he remains saddened at the thought of what life he and his now partner could have had. He had lived a very comfortable life. This was all taken away. He says, nothing will be able to undo what I was subject to. Sir, that brings an end to the summaries to be read for the clients of Hudgell Solicitors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Patrick. Here comes Mr. Blake
Thank
to
you.
tell me how to proceed henceforth.
May I propose a 10-minute break, and then we have
Yeah.
our final witness, which is Miss Arch.
Certainly. So, what's that? 25 to
25
4?
to. Yes,
Fine.
thank you.
Yeah, fine.
Thank you, Chair. The next witness is Nicola Arch.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Arch. It's rather symmetrical that you are one of the first persons that I met when I started this work, and now we end these hearings with your oral evidence. So good to see you again.
Thank you, and you.
Mrs. Arch, you should have in front of you a witness statement that is dated the 15th of March of this year.
It is, yeah.
Yes, and could you please turn to the final page of that? That's page 19.
Yep.
Is that your signature
It
at
is,
the
yeah.
bottom? And can you confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
And as the Chair has said, you assisted SOWIN during the non-statutory phase of this inquiry, and you've provided a transcript and a human impact statement from that stage as exhibits to the witness statement, and all of those will become evidence in due course. I'm going to start today with your background. Can you tell us where you were born and where you grew up?
I was born in Bristol, and I grew up in a sleepy village called Wootton and Dredge. And then I went on to college in the Stroud area, and then took residence there where my fiancé was.
And I think you trained as a teacher, is that right?
Yes, I did.
What was your first post office job?
That was as a counter assistant at Brimscombe Post Office, just as an assistant.
And was that in 1993?
It was, yeah.
You then became something called a relief worker, is that right?
Yeah, they sold it, Brimscombe Post Office, and a family took over, so I wasn't required. So I then did relief work because the sub-postmasters couldn't get anyone to cover them on holidays and things. So I decided I'd work all over Stroud in Gloucestershire, covering for everyone's holidays. So I pretty much worked in most of the small sub-offices throughout Stroud.
And by 1998, you were at Chalford Hill Post Office,
I
is that
was,
right?
yeah.
And how did you get involved in that post office?
I started there on relief, and then the sub-postmistress got diagnosed with terminal cancer, and unfortunately she passed away. So the husband wanted to keep the post office within the village, so he applied to take over the postmaster position. Even though he wasn't working in the post office, he was what we'd call a ghost postmaster, and asked if I would take it on and continue working there in order to keep the post office within the community, which is what I did.
Was it just a post office?
No, he also gave me the opportunity to pay for the stock and to take over the shop. And I could run the shop as I see fit, alongside the post office. He would give me a small salary from the post office, and the shop would be mine as a new business venture. So with me and my fiance just sort of setting up in the area, it seemed like a brilliant opportunity for us to start a little business of our own. So
you were in effect doing the job of a sub-postmistress?
yes.
And running the shop?
Yes.
Did you live nearby at the time?
I lived about 2.5 miles away from Chalford Hill Post Office, in the sort of village that sat next door to it. So we just joined a shared ownership scheme with the government to buy a little 2 up, 2 down terrace and get on the ladder. So that was sort of our developing stage. We'd had the business. My husband, who is my husband now, worked locally as well. So we bought a property, set up, ready to start a new life in Stroud.
And how old were you at that stage?
Which year are we talking?
Well, when you first started in that post office?
When I started at Brimpscombe, I was sort of 23, and then by the time I'd got to Chalford, I was about 27.
I'm going to ask you about the rollout, and that's something that this inquiry is going to be looking at the next phase in the summer. Can you tell us what the rollout was?
When Horizon came about, obviously I'm trying to remember 22 years ago now, but we had a memo come through to say that it was going to be computerised, which I welcomed because I'd bought all new fittings in the shop and modernised that. So the thought of modernising the post office as well, I welcomed, and also it took so long to do it all manually that I thought, well, with the computer system, within a couple of hours on balancing, we'd get it all done in half the time. So I was one of the first. We had a memo to say Chalford Hill was going to be one of the first rollout branches, which I was under the impression that it was a limited amount of offices. They would install the equipment in, say, for example, 50, and as it worked well and progressed, then it would then go on for a bigger rollout throughout the country. But they were just going to initially install it into the first few, which I was one of them.
And can you tell us about the installation, what that involved?
Yeah, well, they turned up, well, there was one gentleman who turned up, engineer, and set it up, but it was a very tiny post office, so he sort of went in about half hour before, set it all up so it was running, and then he left, and then we opened the post office so it was open running, and the shop, and the trainer was sat with me, and every time a transaction needed to be done, we were trying to do it at the same time, and within a couple of hours the trainer left me with a big manual and said anything I needed to know thereon after would be in this manual.
So you were being trained while people were coming in and out of the post office. Were you there for the balancing when you were training?
Not whilst I was training, no, because that was the morning, and I wasn't due to balance to the following day in the evening, well, at the end of the business day. So, no, I hadn't done any balancing work whatsoever on the system.
I'm going to ask you about shortfalls and discrepancies. When did you first experience a shortfall?
The first week. The first time I did the balance, minus a few, I think it was about £13, it was £1,000 exactly short. I could see why. The pension dockets that we did, that people brought in, I added them up manually because it seemed an awful lot, and I wanted to compare it with the computer system so I knew I'd got it right. And at the end of each day, we'd send all the dockets off out of the building, and I wanted a paper copy, so I used a printout calculator and added the dockets up myself each day before I sent them to Ireland, because they'd go to Ireland and I'd never see them again.
Can I just ask you, what are pension dockets for those?
Pension dockets are, it's like a checkbook, like an old-fashioned checkbook. There's 2 dockets per page, and each docket represents 1 week's of a pension, whether it be family allowance, old age pension, or whatever. The customers would bring the book in, we would stamp it, take out the docket and keep it, but then the computer system, when the system first got installed, you'd have to then put it into the computer system as well. So in fact, it was twice as much work, to be honest, because we had to put it in the computer as well as do it manually when we first started off. And then each day, as soon as you had a pile of them, because we would have, 50, 60 customers coming in the morning, same in the afternoon, then we'd add them up. We didn't have to, but I would add them up with the calculator at the end of the day, then keep the printout of the calculator with it, and then I would send the dockets off. Then I would check my total against the Horizon total per day, and it was right. And so I knew that everything was running as it should, or so I thought. But then on day 7, ready for balancing, the computer would automatically calculate my weekly totals for me, where the weekly total didn't add up to the daily totals. And so I could see that it was wrong.
And on seeing that it was wrong, did you call the helpline?
I did, yeah, straight away. The first week, I called them and said, I can see there's a problem. My daily figures are correct. What I've paid out to customers is correct. My cash is correct. But the weekly total generated by Horizon is incorrect. And she said, well, it's only the first week. What am I expecting? I should just wait for it to settle down. It will correct itself. And teething problems are bound to happen, and that I needed to stop being negative about being modernised.
Did it settle down?
No. Week 2, the 1,000 doubled exactly to 2,000. Because I'd kept my daily totals as I did the first week, I did exactly the same the second week, and I kept my calculator printouts each day. Looked on the weekly, and the weekly generated total from Horizon was completely different, short again, and it had doubled the shortage. The first week it was 1,000, the second week it was 2, and this habit continued for the first 6 weeks.
Did you continue to call the helpline?
I called them every single week, and I explained what I could see, and I kept my calculator printouts for each bundle of dockets, so I had it there. And then week 7, I had a visit.
And that's an audit?
Yes.
I think you've said in your statement that by week 6 it had reached £32,000.
Yeah. It was literally doubling, square rooted every day. So it went from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32. And I rang every time. When
it had reached £32,000, did you again phone the helpline?
I did, yeah. And I was getting quite cross then. And I said, this isn't right. And I don't know what I can do about it. But I had to declare that everything was fine cash-wise, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to trade the following day. And obviously I didn't have the money to put in. And that was something, although I've listened to the inquiry, it was something I never really got involved in. When I balanced it each week, it may be out £20 one week, £10 the next, but I never touched the money. I let it be as it was and declared, and then it would correct itself naturally over time, and manually it always did. But obviously with this, it never did.
And the auditors arrived.
Yeah.
Do you remember how many were there?
There was 3, I thought, 3 auditors. I recognised one of them because I'd been with Post Office for nearly 10 years then. So I'd had a couple of audits randomly in different offices that I happened to be working in. So one of them I recognised. And they said they'd come along to do an audit. I welcomed them, thought it was great, thought the helpline was actually being helpful. So I thought, they're obviously coming to address the problems that I'd been talking about. So I let them in. The auditor and one of the gentlemen went into the post office because it was a very small cubicle type setup. They went on in, started the audit, and I stood out into the stock room around the back with the lady who came with them, and made everyone coffee, had a chat, just normal chit-chat, everything was fine. And then the gentleman, not the auditor, come out. He then said, oh, do you know you're £32,000 short? And I said, yes, I rang the helpline last night. I've already told them about this. I said, but it's been an ongoing problem, and I thought you were going to check it out for me to make sure everything's okay.
And what was the response to that?
And he said, oh, right, okay. Well, we do need to ask you about it, he said, but I don't think we'll be asking you about it here. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, it's too small. He said, we'd be better sat round a table. And obviously, I didn't have the room. The post office cubicle was tiny. So I had no problem with that. He said, I think what we'll do is we'll go over to Stroud Crown Office, which is about 6 miles away.
And how did you get to Stroud?
Well, I thought logic would be that I said, well, I'll come over in my car because I lived about 3 miles away from the post office, so I drove to work. I said, what I'll do, I'll follow you over to Stroud in my car, and then as soon as we're done, I can nip back and open the shop and get the post office up and running again. That seemed the most practical. He said, no, you won't be doing that. He said, well, I would prefer it if you came in our car. And at that point, I was getting a bit, well, that's a bit odd. And I said, oh, well, that's a bit strange. Why would I want to come in your car? And he said, well, the parking in Stroud is awful and it's double yellow lines outside the Crown Office, so you're probably better just coming in our car, and then we will bring you back anyway. So I thought, oh, well, that makes sense because it is awful parking in the middle of town. So I thought, well, yeah, that's fine then. I said, well, I'll just ring the owner of the business and let him know that the post office, because obviously the villagers would be asking him, oh, why is the post office shut? So I said, oh, I'll just ring him and let him know. He said, yeah, you can ring him and let him know where you are and that you'll let him know how the day progresses. And I said, oh, right, fine. And I thought he was just sort of talking gibberish, to be honest. So I just rang the owner and said, oh, I'll be back in about an hour. I said, I've got to go over, answer a few questions, and then they're going to drop me back. I said, but I'll put a sign on the door so the customers know, no problem. So then they put me in the back. Well, they didn't put me in the back of the car. I got in the back of the car with the lady, and the gentleman was driving. And on the way there, she was sort of saying, oh, this looks a very expensive place to live, which I thought was a bit of an odd thing to say. And I said, well, it is, it's in the Cotswolds, so it is, it's not cheap. But I said, we've managed to get a shared ownership property, so we're just sort of getting ourselves on. Oh, that's very nice. It must take a lot of money. I said, well, yeah, it is, but, we're both working and, we're getting on. So that's good. And then we got to the Crown Office, and then she was in front of me and he was behind.
When you got to the Crown Office, were you on your own?
Yeah.
Were you offered legal representation?
No, because we were going what I thought was for a chat.
And where did you go in the Crown Office?
We had to walk through the main business side. It had about 12 counters, and it was really busy, but we walked through that and then out through a side door into a little back room.
And who was in that room?
No one. The gentleman walked in first, I walked in second, and the lady was behind me, and then the door shut, and it was a pin-coded door, so I was locked in.
Can you describe the conversation that you had at that point?
They then said, oh, do you mind if we record this conversation? And I then said straight away, well, why would you want to record it? And the gentleman then said, I don't think you actually realise how much trouble you're in. And I was just taken aback. I said, what do you mean? I've done nothing wrong. He then went on to say that he's ex-CID, he'd met people like me before, he knew a liar when he saw one, and rather than waste more time, could I just tell them what I've done with the money so that they could all go home? And obviously, I hadn't touched any money whatsoever, so I made it crystal clear to him that there's no way I was going to say I've taken money when I haven't taken a penny. They'd spotted a postcard on the wall that I'd sent to the customers because I'd had a week's holiday. And he said, oh, I noticed you've been on a week's holiday. Did we pay for that? And obviously I said, don't be so ridiculous, no. Well, this carried on until 4:45 in the afternoon.
So when did it start, or approximately?
We got there about 11 o'clock, and I was locked in. I didn't leave the room at all until they took me back at 4:45 and said they would have to come back to me again because I've continually lied to them all day. which he was very annoyed about, which I just let him get on with it. I thought, that's your opinion, whatever. And yeah, then we took back and he said, you do realise, he said, you will never step one foot in that post office ever again.
Having dropped you outside the post office,
Yeah.
were you able to get into the post
No,
office?
he kept hold of the keys since the audit had finished. Since we left, he locked the door when we left, and I never had the keys back, ever.
And how did you feel at that point?
There was a mixture of things. So I was probably, I would say, in shock, because I'd gone to work that morning as a normal, looking forward to the day. Yes, there was problems, but nothing for me to worry about. And then all of a sudden, everything had gone. I didn't know how I was going to pay my bills. I didn't know what was going to happen to the shop. It just all happened so out of the blue. I had no time to really understand what on earth was going on. I just got in my car, went straight home. I can't remember the journey going home at all. But I got home and I rang my mum and my fiancé to say what had happened, and I was absolutely hysterical at that point.
I'm going to ask you about your suspension and termination. You weren't the sub-postmistress. What happened to the sub-postmaster at that stage?
He then rang me, it was about 7:30 in the evening the same day, and said the post office had been to his home and basically said to him that he either gets rid of me or they will go after him. And he was a 74-year-old gentleman. He'd just lost his wife 4 months prior to that of cancer, and he'd been married to her for 49 years. And he just said, I can't go through that, which I could sort of understand. So he said, I'm sorry, but he said, but I'm going to have to do as they tell me to do, or I'm going to land up in prison. And I said, well, what have they told you to do? He said, well, I've got to suspend you at the moment, and then they will let me know what to do next. And then within 3 weeks, I'd had a letter to say I was sacked.
On receiving that letter, how did you feel?
I couldn't believe it, because I'd done absolutely nothing wrong. I was excited for the future of the post office and all that it entailed with all the modernisation, etc. And within a day, within a year, everything had gone. I could not get my head around it. I was in a state of shock. I was put on antidepressants. I just could not accept that I'd gone from starting a new, happy life with a new business to losing absolutely everything on that day and being mistrusted as well. And then it appeared in the papers also.
I was going to say, how did people come to be aware of it?
I didn't know at all that it had been made public. And then my now husband's grandmother rang the next day and said, is that the same Nicky as we know that they're saying is stolen from the post office? And his grandmother had gone to her local post office and saw it on the front page of the Stroud News and Journal that I'd been stealing off of old age pensioners. And that was 3 weeks after.
Are you aware of how they knew?
I have no idea, but it wasn't from me.
How were you treated by the local community at that point?
It was just awful. I went to the local supermarket. I felt like it was silent when I walked through the door. One day I got spat on twice outside. It was all in my hair. And it got to the point where I think it was part paranoia and part of what was true, but I felt like everyone was talking about me. I was the lady who stole off of elderly people, and I just couldn't deal with it, so I stayed indoors and never ever went out.
And was there a particular link with elderly people because it related to pensions? Is that?
I assume so. That was conjured up by the post office, and that was how they worded it in the Stroud News and Journal, that I've been stealing off of elderly pensioners through the pension dockets. So yeah, that was how the public perceived it, I guess.
Moving on to the prosecution, about 12 months later you were notified of the prosecution. What were you charged with?
Theft and fraud. They'd charged me for £24,000 of theft. Apparently they'd found £8,000, and fraud for making the accounts correct for business on Thursday.
And was that a letter that came through the post?
Yeah.
How were you when you saw that letter?
I would safely, I was absolutely shattered. I'd give in then. I didn't want to exist, to be honest. My husband was at work. I rang him at work and said, you know, they're charging me, because we was absolutely convinced there was no way they would charge me. They would see the sense it would either correct itself, or it would obviously happen again, or they would soon realise that it wasn't me. So, and because we hadn't heard for so long, I'd been questioned twice in the local police station by them, and nothing had changed. And so we genuinely believed that it was going to get dropped. So when I received that was just devastating.
How were you doing financially at that stage?
We were getting in trouble. Well, I was, because I hadn't worked. It was all in the papers. And my husband was a lorry driver. Well, he was a tree surgeon at that point, but he was self-employed. So a lot of the bills weren't getting paid. And it got to the point where we had to decide whether we sold the house or had it repossessed. Because we weren't going to be able to carry on not paying the bills. And it seemed more realistic to me to sell the property and try and get the asking price for it so that we could pay the bills. But we couldn't in the end, because I wouldn't go out mentally. I'd been on Prozac then for a year. But I still couldn't face the world in any way, shape or form. So we decided to sell it at a reduced price to get a quick sale so that we could leave the village. And that was the only way I was prepared to go outside, as if we would leave Stroud and go back to Wootton, where I came from. And so we moved in with my parents.
Now, you've told us that your fiancé at some point became your husband. Was it around that time?
Yeah, it was. Well, he decided that we was getting married. I was trying to persuade him not to marry me, because I thought it would be far better life for him to be able to walk away and not be involved in all this mess. It seemed madness to me that he would want to stay and get involved, but he was adamant that he wanted to stand by me. So we arranged to get married. I wouldn't celebrate in any way, because I felt it was inappropriate with court cases and things coming up. I didn't want to pretend I was happy and everything when I wasn't. So we went to the registry office and just got married, and then just went home again. And that was the end of it. But then we had a evening visit to the solicitors on the Thursday leading up to the trial, and he said that I'm likely that I'm looking at 7 years in prison, because every single piece of evidence that I'd asked for, including my calculations that I'd done on the calculator, the post office refused to supply them to me. They'd also, destroyed the recordings, so I couldn't have a copy of the recorded interviews either. And so the solicitor basically said that due to the lack of evidence, he was really concerned that I was going to struggle to prove my innocence. So, I need to prepare myself for prison. So I remember walking home that night with my fiancé, and then we decided that, well, he suggested that maybe we'd take all the tablets that the doctor would give us to get through it, and we would end it all that day, and then we would never have to go through a court case. I'd never been in a court before in my life. And I was terrified. I have to admit, I was terrified, but there was no way I was going to go and say I'd done something when I hadn't. So I seriously considered this, and he said, I'll stand by you no matter what. He said, but if you don't want to go through it, I totally understand. We'll drive off somewhere nice and just eat all the tablets. And it seemed like quite a good option at the time, to be honest.
You mentioned not being able to get hold of certain documents, and at the beginning of your evidence, you talked about keeping quite a good record.
I did. I was very, very sharp on it because I knew I hadn't understood the computer system as well as I should have done, but 2 or 3 hours was not enough when people were interrupting me coming in. So I wanted to do my own records as well, but they wouldn't let me in the building. I had to get a friend and my now husband to empty the shop for me because I wasn't even allowed to go back into the shop. I asked for my printouts of my calculations so that I could actually stand a chance of explaining what was happening because I could see what the problems were. But I was refused entry. Even my cash register and everything I bought, everything they kept. I didn't have nothing back.
The case would have started at the Magistrates' Court. Was
It
that
did.
Stroud Magistrates' Court?
It did, yeah.
And then it went to Gloucester Crown Court?
It did, yeah.
And eventually it was transferred to Bristol Crown
Yes.
Court. Was that over a relatively long period of time?
It wasn't really, because in Stroud I had to put in the plea, which was obviously not guilty. And then we went to Gloucester, and I don't know why it was changed to Bristol, but it was a matter of months. And then up to April 2002, the date was set for Bristol Crown Court.
Now, we've heard during the course of these human impact hearings about people who have pleaded guilty on advice. You didn't plead guilty.
No,
Why not?
because I wasn't guilty. And also, I think, because I've got to know a lot of the victims, obviously, and they've got families and things. I had no children. I'd lived quite an independent life with my husband. Maybe if I'd have had babies, I would have thought, if there's a chance of me not leaving them, then maybe I would have been tempted. But no, I didn't have children, and that made it easier for me to think, right, okay, we'll do a prison sentence, if that's what it's going to take, because there's no way I'm going to say I've done something when I haven't. So it was a question of making arrangements to go to prison, which is what I did, for meals and bill paying and things like that. I got my sisters and my brothers involved, and they would, because Steve my husband wasn't very good at things like that. So I managed to make arrangements so that everything would be in place. And luckily, because we'd moved to Mum's and got rid of the house, he wouldn't have to sort that out anyway. I was in an IVA at that point to pay the bills, so it was one payment. So Steve was earning enough to make that payment, so it seemed that I was ready to go to prison.
Very briefly, who can you recall giving evidence for the prosecution?
The post office actually requested the sub-postmaster and my part-timer to be witnesses for them, and they also had two elderly customers. But as it happened, they were all very favourable to me and didn't do the post office any favours whatsoever.
And you gave evidence.
I did.
How was that experience?
It isn't easy. No, it was probably one of the worst things I would wish upon anyone. I had prison officers next to me, obviously. I'd been in the trial for 2 days by then, by the time I was called up. The post office barrister was very aggressive. He was very frustrated with what he would describe as my attitude, the fact that I was wasting everybody's time by denying it. He threw a bundle of pension dockets actually at me at one point, and luckily the judge of the case stopped it and said, that's enough, she's not going to say any different now, so can you move on? and he just sat down then and, yeah, it went to deliberation at that point.
So there came a time for the judges summing up. What do you
Yep.
remember about that?
I'm absolutely convinced he believed me, because he pointed out to the jury straight away. He said, obviously when you go to deliberate and consider everything that you've heard, please consider whether a crime has actually even happened here. And when he said that, I thought he knows I've done nothing. And I got reassurance from that, I have to say, because obviously we were all sent out then and I had to just wait in the corridor for the verdict, which was just the worst few hours of my life, I would suggest. But it did make it easier knowing, because I genuinely believed, if nothing else, that judge knows that I'm innocent. And I was quite proud of that, to be honest.
And can you tell us what the verdict was?
Not guilty.
And
Unanimously.
What was the atmosphere like?
Unbelievable. It was very strange, because the judge said, right, Nicola, you can go. The prison officers let me out, because obviously I was locked in. And I walked out into the corridor and it was completely empty. Everyone had gone home. But my husband and family and all were still in court because the judge hadn't released them at that point. But I just stood there, and my father was in hospital, so he wasn't there anyway. And I just fell to my knees. I couldn't believe it, that it was actually all over after all that time that we'd got to this point. The post office just left. They didn't acknowledge it whatsoever. They just left the building, and that was that. And then the judge released my family and my husband, and then he'd come out, and then we just celebrated. And my mum was in hospital with my father at the time. He'd gone into hospital with kidney failure, and he discharged himself for the evening to come home so that we could have a little get-together at home to celebrate, which is what we did.
And thinking about the impact on you...
Before we go on, Mr. Blake, could I just intervene to ask this? When you say that the post office called witnesses to give evidence against you, like, for example, the sub-postmaster himself, I take it those persons gave oral evidence at the trial?
They did, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did.
It's often the case, and I only put it in this way because I just want you to try and help me by remembering if you can. But it's often the case that some parts of the prosecution evidence is actually read to the jury, all right? And can you remember whether statements were read to the jury, for example, about what Horizon had found?
No.
There was nothing like that, was there?
No. They asked, the legal team were just asking, I remember them asking each individual, do you know Nikki? What do you think's happened to the money? Are you sure?
But that's what's slightly confusing me, Mrs. Arch. At some point in time, the post office would have had to try and establish that money had gone missing, to put it loosely, all right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what evidence they may have called, either read or orally, to establish that money was missing.
They literally went by the weekly balance sheet of what Horizon told them.
Well, that I think you've answered my question now. So that there was evidence before the jury about what Horizon had said.
Yes.
Yeah,
They had the documents, the weekly report.
Yeah, that's
every
fine.
week.
That's
yeah.
fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did you manage to find a job after that?
Not directly, because, again, whilst we were in stride, sort of a year or so, up until the trial, no. After the trial, yes, I did. About sort of 6 months. It took me a while to come to terms with what had happened and try and sort of... I attempted to come off of the medication that I was on, but that wasn't a good idea, so I stayed on that. And yes, I did get a job eventually.
And there was also some good news. You had a child.
Yes.
What was your physical health like, though?
It wasn't too bad. In 2005, which obviously was only a couple of years after the trial, we decided to try for a child, and I did get pregnant. but as soon as I went into labour, I had to have a caesarean, and then they found out that everything was diseased inside. So I had to have a radical hysterectomy, so I wasn't able to have any more children after that. I'd been on antidepressants since this happened, and I'm still on them today. I've tried several times, 3 or 4 times now, to come off them, and it never really works. It's not a good idea. And it keeps me stable, and it keeps me able to live a general life. I've got fibromyalgia, arthritis, anemia, vitamin B deficiency, and so on. So I've got several problems health-wise, and obviously menopause because of the hysterectomy. And I've had to have 2 operations on my feet, and so I've got no feeling in my left foot at all, which causes me to have a lot of falls, which recently I broke my foot. So unfortunately at 48 I retired due to ill health because I'd had several falls at work and damaged my shoulder and my kneecap, and the risks was getting a bit too often, so I took ill health retirement at 48.
I want to ask you now about the JFSA.
Yeah.
I think you joined in 2014.
Yes.
Why did it take so long to, in between your prosecution, to get involved?
Well, I hadn't heard anything, and I'd actually chose to try and put it by me, obviously, when it happened. But as soon as the trial was over, I thought, right, that's it. I've got to try and make a life for myself now. And I was in a different town as well, which helped. So, yeah, I put it behind me. And then I saw on Google, I was on the computer, and then I saw it must have been at the point when Second Sight was doing their work. And it caught my eye, and I thought, oh, my God, that's the same problem. And I then started reading up on it. And then I got in touch with Alan Bates, and then I heard of Nick Wallace. And then he was prepared to do a story about my story and listen to me. And it was the first time somebody had sort of shown any interest, and so I did an interview with Nick. He followed my story on, introduced me to loads of other people involved, and then I joined the JFSA and supported it ever since, because as it unfolded in the meetings, it started off with 50 people. The next minute we knew we had 300, then 400 people, then 500. It was just absolute madness. So that's how, and I've been with them and stuck with them ever since, trying to get some sort of justice.
And in terms of compensation, interim payments, you haven't received an interim payment, is that right? And that's because you weren't successfully prosecuted.
Yes.
You wrote to the Prime Minister, I think,
I wrote to the Prime Minister, and I also wrote to Mr. Scully as well. I wrote to my local MP because, to me, malicious prosecution is exactly that. You're either maliciously prosecuted or you're not. To me, that area of the law, and I could well be wrong because I'm not obviously adverse to that, but to me, that area is about the prosecution, and I was maliciously prosecuted. I lost absolutely everything. It was all in the papers and everything else. And now the post office has decided to bend the rules again and decide that unless you were convicted, you can't have a malicious prosecution claim. And I just do not understand why that would be.
So in terms of the interim payment, what were you told?
I was first told by Mr. Scully that I was entitled to pursue a malicious prosecution claim, so therefore an interim payment was likely. And then I had a letter to say he'd made a mistake, and that in fact, because I'm not entitled to a malicious prosecution claim, I'm not entitled to an interim payment either.
You were also part of the group action, is that right?
Yep.
And you did receive some compensation for that?
I did.
You've also submitted another letter from Mr. Scully in relation to that? Is that right?
I don't know.
No. Well, can you tell us about the group action, please?
Well, obviously, I really appreciate the JFSA. Without them, none of us would be where we are. So, you know, that goes without saying. But I was actually paid £9,500 in total. And so I thought that was ridiculous, obviously, because I'd lost far more than that. But the settlement agreement that they agreed to after the group litigation, you know, there was an agreement made that those without a conviction cannot pursue a malicious prosecution claim, and it's a clause within that settlement agreement, which I was annoyed about because I felt that for those, I mean, I'm trying to find out how many of us there are that were actually proven to be innocent, so that we could get together and actually investigate this and take it further, because it just seems ridiculous to me. And we're struggling to find, you know, at the moment there's Suzanne Palmer, who I believe has already given evidence already, myself, Lee Castleton is slightly different but similar. But I can't seem to find anyone else who's in that same position. But I believe we should have been shown that settlement agreement before it was agreed, because I never would have agreed to it.
What do you feel about compensation for those who were acquitted?
To me, it shouldn't be questioned. To me, if you're maliciously prosecuted, you're maliciously prosecuted. You know, to me, the law is absolutely crystal clear. And I do not understand why the Post Office seem to have the ability to bend our country's rules to suit them. Because every single time that you think you're a step forward, and yes, we won as a Gillo, we didn't win at all. The Post Office made this deal, paid 56 million quid, which is absolutely disgusting considering the amount of lives they have absolutely ruined and wrecked. They were the winners. But Judge Fraser has made it crystal clear that they were guilty, totally guilty, and now they're deciding what they want to do about it. So they're carrying on that behaviour, that learned behaviour that we know they're very good at. You know, it's almost like plausible deniability, that they get this learned behaviour that reeks through the whole company. And even now they're saying, yeah, we were found guilty, but we'll pay compensation our way, and we'll do it when we want to do it, and we'll do it in such a way that suits us. And I do not understand, for a company that guilty of wrecking that many lives, why they're allowed to dictate how we move forward, because none of us can move forward until they abide by the law and pay back what they've stolen off of the victims involved in this. They've taken money that wasn't rightly theirs to take. All the shortages and things that people have given them, put their tills right, paid 20,000, sold their properties to put it right. They've put all this money in the kitty. The Post Office had no right to take a penny of that money, yet they still have it, and they still own it and get interest on it, and still all the victims are waiting. I do not understand why they are allowed still, and now they'll say, well, we'll wait for the inquiry, we'll wait for that to end and see how it goes then. Why are they allowed to dictate how they serve their punishment when they have been found guilty by the biggest court in this country, from the High Court? What was the whole point in Judge Fraser doing all that work, writing that incredible judgment, for us all to ignore it and say, well, Post Office, do what you want when you want. Just let us know when you're ready. Because that's what it feels like now.
What would you like from the Post Office?
I think an apology is pointless. I asked for an apology and they refused to give me one because I wasn't convicted. Apparently the apology is linked to conviction as well, which to me is shambolic. I'm slightly different. I don't want to sound disrespectful to the victims who've been to prison, because I cannot imagine what they have gone through. What worries me the most now is if we worked out who are the guilty parties in this, there's hundreds and hundreds of people who are guilty, not just the Paula Venables or this CEO, that CEO. We've got, to me, all the barristers that sat back and watched these people get prosecuted week in, week out, week in. Nobody saw a habit growing. Nobody thought, oh, this is a bit strange. All the judges, everywhere, all the post office, the government, the bays, all the people, if we added up all the people who are guilty and party to this event, the victims will be waiting for years and years to get them all through the court system to be proven guilty like they are. So to me, and then we will lose even more postmasters. We've lost 33 already. If we carry on waiting and waiting and waiting for all these people to go through the courts, it'll take more than my lifetime. I'm in my 50s now. I was in my 20s when this happened. To me now, I would love a name and shame. Let's have a couple of newspapers with all their faces in and all their names, so we can all see what they done and who they done it to. We'll have pages of that. What worries me more is poorly victims now who are at very tender stages of their lives, waiting and waiting for the year that their person who did it to them might go to trial, because that could take 10, 20, 30 years from now. So I think it's fruitless. I don't see the point in wasting taxpayers' money on these people. I wouldn't give them the time of day. Let's get their faces in the paper and their names so we all know who did what and when and to, and move on. Give us our money back, our right redress, our compensation, so we can build new lives and start again and never, ever have to think about the post office again. That is what I think should happen.
Thank you. Chair, do you have any questions at all?
No, thank you very much. My last few words are these. First of all, thank you so much for coming to give oral evidence, Mrs. Arch, and thank you for the clarity of your evidence. And I'm so pleased that you felt able to engage with the inquiry in the way you have. And secondly, which is not confined to Mrs. Arch, but is my heartfelt thanks to everyone who has participated in this phase of the inquiry. Today marks the end of the human impact public hearing sessions in England and Wales. There will be sessions in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but that is the end in England and Wales. And I am very grateful, as I've said, to all those who have been willing to participate in these sessions. Just in case there is any confusion, there are still 3 focus groups which deal with human impacts, which will occur, 1 tomorrow and 2 next Friday. But as I have said, once those are complete, then that will mark the end of the human impact phase of this inquiry in England and Wales. And I will make an announcement about when we can resume in Scotland and Northern Ireland as soon as appropriate arrangements are made. So thanks to everyone. Mr. Blake, is there anything further to add at this stage?
Not at all. Thank you very much.
No, well, it's been, I think I said before these hearings commenced that I expected that they would be very informative, and that's a very dry legal word to use, but in fact it's an accurate word to use about these sessions. So thanks to everyone.